The days are longer, the calendar is filling up, and I want to feel as good as this beautiful summer weather. That's why I've been loving Groons. It's one daily pack of gummies that covers my greens, vitamins, and minerals, and even has 6 grams of prebiotic fiber. So I don't need to juggle a complicated wellness routine on top of everything else. They taste amazing. They're easy to toss in my bag on the go. Plus, they're vegan, gluten free, and HSA, FSA eligible for reimbursement. Save up to 52% off with promo code podcast at gruns.co. That's code podcast at gruns.co.
Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I'm your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 192, recording on Tuesday afternoon, August 18th, a few days after the Vikings played their first preseason game at MetLife Stadium in New York, or New Jersey, I should say. I was there for The Athletic, where I do my day job, and we're going to have some thoughts after the trip. Also went through the tape, also been thinking a lot about joint practices this week. So we're going to hit a bunch of stuff. Quarterbacks, J.J. McCarthy, Caleb Banks, some sneaky under-the-radar players who really I think you guys need to be keeping eyes on based upon what I'm seeing and hearing. So looking forward to diving into all of that. Before we do, I just want to say, if you're watching on YouTube, first, thanks for doing it. Please hit the subscribe button. It helps us out. We've built this show now for 2 years and still growing and enjoying doing that. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify or iHeart or wherever you get your podcast, please follow us on those services. Give us a rating. Hit the 5 stars. It takes 2 seconds, but we really appreciate it. All right, let's hop right into the Q&A portion because that's what we do. On the early week episode of the show, we will be back later this week with a guest who you're pretty familiar with, so I'm looking forward to that. But the first question comes from Chris Fellerman at New Home Pro SD. And it's a bunch of questions. With Jamal Adams out for the year, how will the Vikings address this loss? Will Harrison Smith return? Will Moore fall to Josh Metellus to make vocal and scheme looking adjustments? Or is there a rookie/past Viking that will? So I really would like to sum up those 4 questions as like, Alec, please talk about what the circumstance is right now at safety coming off of that Jamal Adams injury. And I will absolutely, and I think it's a necessary subject. I think it's one that definitely deserves some attention in the aftermath of what happened Saturday. And I'll just say, like, I didn't see the Jamal Adams injury in real time. I did notice from the press box that someone was in the medical tent, and then a bunch of the Vikings veteran players, Josh Metellus, Byron Murphy Jr., and then even defensive coordinator Brian Flores went over to the medical tent. And I mean, I remember, just seeing Josh Metellus come out of the tent and just put his head in his hands. And at that point, it was pretty clear that something really brutal had happened. Jamal Adams, quietly through 2 weeks of training camp, like the night before training camp began, was when the news first surfaced that the Vikings had signed Jamal Adams. And it was an intriguing signing because he's a former number 6 overall pick, former All-Pro, versatile defender who fit very well with what, just you would imagine Brian Flores and how he likes using these guys defensively. And then what was not expected was how quickly, and it really only took 2 weeks, he gelled with the other secondary players. And I'm talking about Josh Metellus and I'm talking about Byron Murphy Jr. Like, there was a day walking off the practice field where Damon Claiborne, the rookie running back, and Jamal Adams and Byron Murphy, they were calling each other Unc and cousin and son and just like having a good time doing it. And you could just tell that over the course of those first few weeks of practice, Jamal Adams was starting to mix in from linebacker, off-ball linebacker role to kind of around the line of scrimmage, and he's blitzing off the edge. And then there were days where he was playing deep safety. And For me, it just felt like, okay. And Kevin O'Connell has validated this in the comments since, but like that Jamal Adams was really carving out a specified type of role within a scheme that's willing to deploy these guys in very creative ways. So the injury was brutal. Earlier in that week, he had even sat down with the secondary members and some of the other members of the defense to just go through his entire story of suffering of really the success he had early, being traded, suffering the torn quad, the mental anguish of that injury, but also like the demons and working back from that injury. And so for the injury to have happened coming off a week where he even further ingrained himself internally and really brought energy to a unit that thrives off of it, just brutal to see. And so like that, the injury in itself, you feel so terrible for the human being in Jamal Adams, but then obviously there is an extension to the conversation of, okay, what does this mean for the Vikings from a depth perspective? And when you add that injury to the already, room and position group at safety that doesn't have a ton of depth, and then you addendum that with Jacoby Thomas, the third round pick, rookie safety who the team had a lot of faith and belief in at the time of the draft, coming from Miami. The fact that he has not practiced over the last 2 weeks in full because of back stiffness. And then you bring about the idea that you're already, trying to replace Harrison Smith and what he's giving you what he's given this defense from an aptitude standpoint. You find yourself in somewhat of kind of a pickle. I mean, I'll kind of break down here how I thought the Jamal Adams role was going to kind of help the defense out. And like, I view it almost as like a domino effect. So with this defense, with how much they like to play with three safeties, you kind of need someone who can play near the line of scrimmage as like a quasi linebacker slot defender type. And in the past, most recently, that's been a Josh Metellus. And then you need two safeties in the deep part of the field. One of them probably needs to be a more rangy type to play, some of the real vertical passing concepts. Some of them needs to be more of the strong safety type where they can drop down and fill in the box, but then also has some coverage flexibility against tight ends, the way that Cam Bynum kind of showed himself to be a couple years ago. And so if you have a Jamal Adams, or in the event that the Vikings started to feel like Jamal Adams could really contribute and he can be more of your box type player, then you can have probably either Jay Ward at the strong safety spot and then Josh Metellus at more of the deep safety spot, which you probably don't feel incredible about, but you at least feel like they understand the system enough to occupy those roles. If you pull out Jamal Adams, then you're really in a difficult position because, okay, who's playing near the box? You'd probably love if it's Josh Metellus, but you kind of need an experienced player on the back end. So like the best way for you guys to think about this is there's like holes that need to be filled, and the potential that Jamal Adams could have plugged one of those holes would have freed the Vikings up to have some flexibility elsewhere. And now they're kind of back to the drawing board where, okay, if Josh Metellus is having to play deep, which you'd probably not prefer from the outset because he's so good near the line of scrimmage, like that's where his strengths lie, then you're just trying to get really creative to patch holes everywhere else. And so, like I've said now for probably a week and a half that the opportunity for Harrison Smith to come back to then provide more flexibility for what it could mean for Josh Metellus, I do think would be important. From everything that I understand right now, you guys are probably wondering, okay, so where does Harrison's decision, like from everything I understand, it's still very much up in the air. I don't know necessarily that there's an impending timeline on that decision, but I do know that Harrison Smith is in tune to the Vikings and where they're at because of how close he is with so many people internally. And so I would imagine he is aware of the stress being placed on that position group. I also think like this joint practice sequence on Wednesday and Thursday against the Baltimore Ravens is going to add another critical data point to how pressing the need is for the Vikings to bring in certain body types. And the other complicating factor here, and you guys are very much aware of this, is like there's not a ton of starting safeties just on the scrap heap right now. Yes, you may be able to pluck a certain skill set from another team or on waivers or via trade or what have you, but it's not like there's a ton of really rangy back end safeties that you can find or a ton of versatile, multiple, smart in the box players who can enter this defense, which is a very complex defense, and learn it on the fly to be ready to go from the outset. So I definitely think first and foremost, the Jamal Adams injury was just brutal from the human perspective, but I also am of the opinion that this position group, which I would say, we haven't had to talk a ton about it in past years, even though last year there was some conversation about the transition with Theo Jackson. I do think this is a position group that is worth eyeing. And, over the course of Brian Flores' last few years here as the team's defensive coordinator, they've been able to minimize, I would say, the pressure on the deep safeties push, just because of their amount of pressure that they apply on quarterbacks, and the offensive line. So the quicker you can force the opposing offense to distribute the football, and the quarterback to distribute the football, the less time those on the back end have to cover. And with as much zone defense as they play, you can kind of cover certain areas. You just still, to be able to make the types of plays this defense wants to make, to force turnovers, to really, squeeze opposing offenses, I think to not have a level of explosiveness, ball hawking, attack, just like really explosive, athletic, physical types of players at all levels of the safety spots that they need, and maybe some of the rookies do end up becoming that. I think that just adds a little bit of stress on the scheme overall and the players everywhere else. Now, I mean, I'm rambling on this, but I will say there is one shining light, I would say, among this group, and it's the undrafted rookie Jacob Thomas from James Madison. He's come in and really from the beginning, he's participated with some of the first and second teams. He had an interception on Saturday, which I think validated what it seemed like in practice in terms of just his processing ability down the field. He doesn't look lost at all from a communication perspective, but I just internally in my own mind, I think about, okay, what would it look like if Jacob Thomas is playing the transition of going from a player in Harrison Smith, who's seen as much as he has, to a guy who's a rookie, undrafted player in the NFL. You just be placing a lot on, again, the scheme and young players' shoulders. And the more you do that, I think the more susceptible you kind of become. So that's a little bit of where I'm at. That's 12 minutes, frankly. It's probably a lot of where I'm at on the safety position, where I think the Vikings are at with the safety position, but it's definitely one that I will just say, I am monitoring both in these joint practices and moving forward from a roster construction standpoint. And it would be probably really nice for Jacoby Thomas to mix back in, not to be confused with Jacob Thomas. We'll just have to call these guys the Thomas brothers, even though they are not brothers. It definitely would be nice to have another potential option who has a level of physicality and explosiveness to be able to kind of mix and match the way they want. So I hope Chris Fellerman, that irons out what I'm thinking about from a safety perspective, but it's a lot of moving parts there, and it's very worth the conversation. The next question comes from Ryan Sackstetter, I believe is the correct name and pronunciation. Not sure about the language of origin, but you've probably seen the discourse over McCarthy's preseason highlights from the 2024 Raiders game. He seemed confident and decisive in his reads and knowing where to put the ball. What do you make of the showing of what he showed in that game versus what he's shown since the meniscus injury? So yeah, I've definitely seen that on social media. There was like a 2-minute clip of highlights from JJ McCarthy's first preseason game that season against the Raiders at US Bank Stadium, and I remember it vividly. I remember in the lead up to that game, the amount of optimism that I remember just receiving from people internally about the progress that JJ McCarthy had made. I remember some practices where he was ripping the ball kind of around the field. And then I just watching the 2-minute clip and going back and watching the film not frequently, but I've done it multiple times over the course of the last couple of years. Like, yeah, there is the word that comes to my mind when I go back and watch that is like a fluidity, a naturalness, just an organic vibe of playing, as opposed to sometimes what it's felt like now watching JJ McCarthy on the practice field or even in the most recent preseason game where it's not fluid, it's a little choppy, it's not smooth, it's more difficult to just like observe all of it. And so yeah, I'd say there is a clear difference to me. Now, I will add the caveats of like, first of all, JJ McCarthy did throw an interception in that game, so it's not as if he was perfect. Second of all, a lot of those throws that JJ McCarthy was making in that preseason game were against static defenses, kind of first read, where it was less about putting the ball, anticipating the ball into certain windows, and it was more about like putting the ball on a player's body. Now there were some throws, like there was a crosser to the left side that I believe he hit to potentially Jalen Naylor, and then there was a deep ball down the left sideline that he hit with touch on it. So like I'm not here to say that, I'm not here to minimize the smoothness of what that tape looks like by comparison to what we've seen recently, but yeah, I mean it's hard to probably identify, Ryan, one specific thing that is a contributor to the dissonance between those two games in those 2 years. I mean, I have to imagine the confidence part of it plays a role. I have to imagine the speed of the game. I mean, JJ McCarthy had just come off, I believe that was in August, so not even 6 months prior, JJ McCarthy had been in the battles of Rose Bowl, of national championships, so he'd seen the live speed of defenses, so there wasn't kind of a break in time over the ability to do that. I imagine there wasn't, I mean, I don't know. I do know this, that like in the lead up to that first preseason game, going back to when JJ McCarthy first got here, there was a lot of focus on mechanics, on footwork, on fundamentals, so it's not like that those coaching points hadn't, are just new or became new last year. Like there was very much an emphasis when JJ McCarthy first arrived to Minnesota to focus on him learning the drops that relate to the timing within the system, that JJ McCarthy needed to focus on not overstriding with his front foot so that, he would lose some accuracy in some of the throws to the left. Like all of those were priorities then leading into that August game. And so, like, I would say perhaps if you had, if you wanted me to just iron out what I would say is the biggest difference, it would probably be just the confidence component and how that has, I'm now speculating. I'm an observer, so I don't want to go to analyzing. So it's not my most comfortable probably position, given I'd like to stick to the reporting and the objectivity and the facts. But yeah, it's a really interesting case study that I do think people around the league have been, will continue to be, and in the future will be attentive to, because I do think there's a lot of lessons to be taken from the entire journey going back to the draft process and what's picked up throughout that process, to the developmental process, to just all of it. There's so many dynamics at play. And so that's why I said this, I believe last week or 2 weeks ago on KFAN with Dan Barrero. It's like, if you're looking for one person or one thing to pin JJ McCarthy's struggles on, I think you are just wholeheartedly missing the nuance and the context and the detail required to really go through all of this? So good question. It's definitely something that I've seen, and hopefully that gives you somewhat of a perspective on how I've thought about that, Ryan. Before we go further on the questions, and we got a lot more: run game, Caleb Banks, so please don't go anywhere. I do want to talk about two of our sponsors. First and foremost, our presenting sponsor, who I cannot thank enough for their support now it's been a while, and we can't thank them enough. Our First Resource Bank, if you don't know about them, you really should. They are a member FDIC bank in the Minneapolis area, and it's a bank with branches all over the place run by really good people. And Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, Charlie Anderson, they are Midwest folks. They are Twin Cities supporters. They are huge Vikings fans. Charlie sent me a text the other day of Kevin O'Connell clip and an interview he did with Kevin Clark of ESPN, who does the show This Is Football. So these guys are locked into the Vikings just like you are. And even more importantly, they are very connected within the business community in the Twin Cities. They have an online banking platform that is phenomenal and easy to use. You walk in any branches, whatever help you need, they can make that happen. So their information is in the description below, and I would just say highly recommend you guys checking them out. And it's not difficult at all to set up an account with them. I also want to talk about Pro Men Athletics. So you guys know how much I love this game. You can see all the football books behind me. I don't do that just for the job. It's actually when you grow up in Alabama, it's kind of becomes part of your daily, I don't know, what you do, what you love. And so for Pro Men Athletics, it's kind of the same way. So it's been very cool to partner with them. So three guys, Kurt, Graham, and Tanner, a couple years ago, they came together. They're like, we all love football in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. How can we lift the tide of youth development of this sport in this place? And so that's what they've done. They've created academies throughout the spring, summer, and winter. They've created 7-on-7 leagues. I know they had one a couple weeks ago with a bunch of local high schools. Tanner Morgan is former Gophers quarterback Tanner Morgan, who trains some of the best high school quarterbacks in the state through Pro Men. So I would just say, if you have a son who plays football, wants to play in middle school, high school, college, and you want to get around people who are invested in their growth and in furthering their passion of the game, cannot say enough about Pro Men, and their information is also in the description. All right, next question comes from the Skull Hop. The run game actually looked pretty good, is what the Skull Hop said. Is it fixed now? All right, first and foremost to this question about the run game, I want to go through a little bit of a journey. You guys willing to go on a little journey with me? So I will take you back to March or late February or March. I probably should have the specific date if you're going to come on this journey with me, of 2023. So it's my first off season as an NFL beat writer. I'd covered Major League Baseball for 3 years, and I'm sitting on a second floor. I literally could go directly to this room in the JW Marriott in Indianapolis at this second floor ballroom with a circular table, and sitting with my fellow Minnesota Vikings beat writers, with Kevin O'Connell, who is going through kind of an off season. I would just, his first thoughts on what the offseason would entail, his first offseason as a head coach. And he talked about the run game, and he talked about wanting efficiency in the run game, and wanting to run the football better in his first offseason or into his second season as an NFL head coach. Ultimately, that conversation, that philosophy resulted in the Vikings did a couple things. They moved on from Dalvin Cook. They positioned Alexander Madison, who they thought would provide them more efficiency. And then they signed Josh Oliver for more personnel flexibility, and rolled with it from there. And then 2024, offseason arrives, more conversation about the run game. Team ends up signing Aaron Jones and talking a lot about improved play style, which essentially, I would just say, was the coach's way of saying they wanted to be more physical at the point of attack. So then 2025 comes, it's a conversation again. Talked about play style again. Aaron Jones talked about simplifying a little bit the types of schemes they wanted to run, but that the run game was again the priority. And I should say that the 2025 run game, if you look at all the numbers, was probably top half in the NFL, and it was better than it ever been in every advanced statistic and metric since Kevin O'Connell has gotten here. So then 2026 comes, and I'm back in Indianapolis at the NFL Scouting Combine, and we're sitting beat writers together on a couch talking to Kevin O'Connell, and he's talking about the run game as a priority. But this time, there is a major difference. He's talking in detail about the coaching changes that have been made in hiring Frank Smith, the former Miami Dolphins offensive coordinator, and in promoting Keith Carter, who had been the assistant offensive line coach, to offensive line coach. And Kevin O'Connell talked about training differently, different philosophies of the type of runs they wanted to generate. And it sounded more, I would just say, from my perspective at the time, it sounded much more detailed, much more actionable than probably the changes or the conversations of the 3 years prior to that. And so my antenna was up at that time. And when I got out to OTAs, this summer, this spring, and I started to see the way the offensive line was training, and Will Fries walking off the field with more beads of sweat rolling off his brow than me right now after just doing a Peloton workout. Like it just felt different. And then I would say throughout this training camp, the priority has remained the different types of run schemes that they're utilizing, the way they are teaching it, the emphasis every single day. Like it definitely feels more foundationally different than at any other time since I've been covering this team in the era of Kevin O'Connell when he first got here. And so like, that's how I would answer that question, Skull Hop, or that's how I would, probably talk about it. But I will also say this, like all of this conversation about it, the creativity, all of it is really good this time of year. I remember the run game looking really good this time of year last year, and being something that Kevin O'Connell wanted to talk about at that time. So really for me, as much optimism as I think I've probably talked about and shown through writing, through podcasts, on radio about this phase of the team, like it's only as good as, okay, what happens in week 1 or week 2 or week 3, and your intent in the run game, you receive a punch in the mouth. Either you're stonewalled at the point of attack, you can't move bodies, your adjustments aren't leading to explosives, and you're backed up in 3rd and long, etc. Like at that point, that's where for me the rubber will meet the road of, okay, have they made a hurdle that is beyond the past years? And I feel like that is a very fair barometer from my standpoint, or expectation point from my standpoint. So that's what I'd say about it. I will say the other like sneaky element to this, to all of it, is that Nolan Teasley, the new Vikings general manager, comes from Seattle, where they just proved that you don't have to have top 5 level quarterback play every single week. But if you position yourself defensively and with a certain run game that maximizes the offensive line talent and is adaptable and creative, then you can get to a certain mountaintop. And so I do. And then when Nolan Teasley got the job, in his press conferences and media availabilities, he talked about the run game and has talked about it relentlessly. And so for me, I just am clued into, if that is a priority majorly and vocally from leadership alongside Kevin O'Connell, I would have to think that has somewhat of a absorption effect, maybe on a deeper level than it's had in past years. So that's how I would how I talk about that one, Skull Hop. But I think it's very relevant. I think it's very important. So I'm glad you asked about it. The next question comes from Ronnie Putetti. Ronnie, appreciate the support. Thanks for listening. Ronnie says, I know adding a veteran defensive end has been talked about, but with Blake Brandel's snapping miscues and Jamal Adams' injury, what would you say the likelihood percentage of the Vikings adding a DEC and safety would be before the season? Great question. And we talked in depth about Jamal Adams, but I'll just start very simply, even though this will probably get aggregated and it probably shouldn't, because there's not much intel behind it. But I would say edge rusher addition to me feels, really high. I would say 80%. Center probably lower, probably like, 40%, and then safety probably 50%, which I feel like aligns nicely with where I'm at with whether or not Harrison Smith decides to play or not. So that's what I'd say. Now I'll go a little more in depth, specifically on edge and safety. Edge and center, because Ronnie, to your point, I do think they both necessitate some real analysis here. The real edge rusher spot that is just feels like a necessity to me is the pass rusher, edge rusher position behind Dallas Turner. Now Dallas Turner's looked really good. Thought he looked good in the game. He's looked like he's got juice. He's looked on the practice field with the work habits, really motivated. Like, there is no nonsense with the way he is going about his work. I stand over there early in practice and watch a lot of those edge rushers and defensive linemen, because it's just a great learning opportunity for me to see what they do in indie drills. And B, it's just like, those are players that I think you got to be up close with in some capacity. But like Dallas Turner, it is just all work, all grind, all attentiveness to the task at hand. But I just feel like, yes, the Vikings have a bunch of former undrafted players who are respected internally. Tyler Batty, Bo Richter, Chaz Chambliss. But the idea for me of, okay, you got to think about depth. And I would say, like, quick aside, and I'll probably get to a little bit more later, but when people talk about this Vikings team and what's possible and what's not, and it's all focused on the quarterback play, I do think the depth of this team and probably best put, like, the lack of a ton of depth does place them in somewhat of a precarious position in the event that injuries occur. And as you guys know, just like I do, they tend to happen in the National Football League because you have 250-pound violent men clashing against one another. So if you pull Dallas Turner out of this defense, yes, you could probably position an argument in front of me of, okay, you'd have Eric Wilson, who can line up a little bit on the edge. Jake Golday is shown some versatility. Tyler Batty definitely has the size for it. Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins has shifted a little bit, like he did Saturday, and played on the edge. And I thought, like, the athleticism and explosiveness, you can see some flashes there. But as much as the Vikings require their defensive front, the edge rushers have to hold the point. When their number is called upon, it really behooves the defense overall to get to the quarterback so that the secondary, which we've already talked about at length, doesn't have to cover for 3+ seconds. So, I just feel like edge rusher, and I've felt it for a while now, and I haven't moved off of it, and I've said it on a lot of podcasts. Like, I just think it is a necessity. Now, you go down the road of, like, okay, Alex, so what options exist? So Von Miller just signed with the Cowboys. Jadeveon Clowney is off the board with the Texans. There's not a ton of options. You've got Leonard Floyd, who played in Atlanta last year. I've watched some of the tape, probably not the most twitchy at this point, but definitely can do what you'd like in terms of holding up at the edge, holding up at the point in the run game, and then adding a little bit of just veteran savvy as a pass rusher. You've got a guy like Joey Bosa. You've got a guy like Hassan Reddick. But those names, and they're bigger names, they do lead you down the road a little bit of, okay, how how willing would they be to just wait out to see if there is an injury where they can then sign as a full-time starter, as opposed to if you sign in Minnesota, you are going to be splitting snaps and backing up Dallas Turner, considering the runway and the path that the Vikings are giving Dallas Turner. So definitely an interesting situation. Then behind those names, I mean, then you're talking about waiver wire ads, very savvy pickups from the front office. And I mean, those feel more like bets and less like lifting the floor, which is the goal of a lot of depth, especially when you're committing to winning and committed to winning in the present, which they obviously are, as proven by what their path has been at quarterback. The center spot. So, I mean, look, Blake Brandel, I would say the tape of Saturday, like he looked pretty good in the run game. I thought, the mobility is definitely there. I think the more questions will come in drop back pass situations, which we'll probably find out a lot more this week against Baltimore. I plan on Wednesday to have my eyes train with intensive observation on the Vikings offense against the Ravens defense. And you got Kyle Hamilton and Jesse Minter mixing it up as the defensive play caller. You've got hopefully good to see Nani Matabike out there. Not sure the status of corners like Marlon Humphrey and Nate Wiggins, but it's a talented group. And so I do think it will provide a nice lens to where this offensive line and Blake Brandel is. But the snap issues have definitely been there throughout training camp. And it shouldn't be that surprising because Blake Brandel had never played the center position at any level before playing last year in London against Cleveland. And the Vikings have been optimistic and committed from the very beginning that the opportunity for Blake Brandel to focus on one position from the spring forward, and given his intelligence and aptitude and willingness to work, that he would be able to handle it. And so for that reason, they passed up on free agent options like Cade Mays, who ended up signing with the Lions and who's now hurt, like Luke Fortson, I believe is his name, who ended up signing elsewhere. And then in the draft, and I've said this, there were opportunities to take rookie centers. The Vikings ended up passing until the 7th round when they took Gavin Gerhardt. And so, I mean, the snap issues stand out. You don't want to see them at all in training camp. I guess it's the one you could spin it positively that they've happened early, but the more the ball is dribbling back to Kyler Murray or forcing Kyler Murray to extend with his hands to catch the snap, which shifts his eyes. I mean, the more concerned I think as an analyst, I'm going to be. For you guys as fans, you probably should be. And then internally, they're going to be. And again, just like the edge rusher spot, this is not the time of year where you just stumble on absolute stud centers. If that was possible, everyone would. I mean, a lot of these teams that are in the need offensive linemen, like that just doesn't happen. So it's always possible, just like with the edge rusher, that a front office has an astute level of evaluation and pluck somebody. But the other aspect that I would say is, given all that is on that position's plate in Kevin O'Connell's offense, to bring someone in this late in the calendar, I mean, you're asking a lot unless it's someone who has an intense familiarity with this system. So a lot to think about, a lot to consider. And I do think those conversations get at, like, I received a question from Nick Miller. What are reasonable expectations? Vegas has them at 8.5 wins. I do think that number in many ways is tied to a few things. One, quarterback play, obviously. Two, the lack of depth, which I've just gotten through talking about. And then three, like, can a defense that has punched above its weight for multiple years continue to do so with personnel that has question marks, is what I would say. So that probably gets at that question. I do want to talk about Caleb Banks. So let's find a question that allows us to do that. This question came from a Twitter user, M. I'm not, the handle is at this crap sucks 35. I don't know what that's a reference to, but this doesn't suck. We got joint practices this week, and a really fun guest for you guys on Friday on the Alec Lewis show. So no, I'm not about that. But the question was, has everyone overreacted to what they saw in the first preseason game? The answer is probably. And overreactions are ripe in the preseason. I was talking with an AFC executive on Monday afternoon, and he was just saying, like, it's always very hard in the preseason because there you are looking for certain opportunities to find players who maybe aren't valued as much, yet you're balancing it with the lack of complexity of scheme and competition and all of that. But I mean, I do think, like, in my earlier this week, if you read it, The Athletic, I did a risers and fallers just based on the film of that preseason game. And one of the fallers was Caleb Banks. And it's not to say, and that's first round pick, defensive tackle from Florida, Caleb Banks. And that's not to make some grand statement that Caleb Banks is a bust or that whatever. Like I if anybody took it that way, I think then you're making overreaction to the 4 paragraphs written there. But I do think there's no question that the film on Saturday of Caleb Banks showed how far he has to go. And that gets at a couple things. One, it just definitely spotlights the work that Caleb Banks is doing every day with defensive line coach Ryan Nielsen. And Caleb Banks even said after the game, like, he knows he's got a lot to learn. There were a lot of mistakes. Pad level was something that he talked about, and that takes a lot of commitment and a lot of work. But I also think it spotlights the defensive tackle depth, and we're talking Levi Drake Rodriguez, you're talking Tyrion Dawkins, you're talking Elijah Williams, who I thought did look really good on film, the former UDFA from Morgan State. So I don't think the Caleb Banks one, I feel pretty convicted in what I saw on the film of just, there were a lot of times where he was too upright, walked back. And so that definitely, is something to note. I will say I was a little harsh on Ivan Pace. I did go back and rewatch it again, the whole game, which is psychopathic probably, but that's, try to bring you guys the most accurate information on the Alec Lewis show. And there was a play that really, Ivan Pace, smashes against the center. The ball spills out. He spins off the center and makes a tackle. So there were some highlights there. I think with Ivan Pace, you get the havoc, both good and bad sometimes. So that's why I had him there. But yeah, that's about it for the first preseason game. I don't think there's much overreaction to be done. I do think that the reactions this week to joint practices are very relevant. Why do I say that? Because Kevin O'Connell values these 2 practices as much as any other data point in the preseason. So if he's going to value them, and he is one of the primary decision makers for this team, I'm going to do the same as an evaluator myself. Before we get to a couple more and then say sayonara for this Tuesday afternoon, I do want to talk about 2 more of our sponsors. The first is Aquarius Home Services. So Aquarius Home Services is your independent authorized Connecticut water systems dealer. It's summer. I believe it's still summer. It's hot enough and humid enough to be summer. And that means home improvement season. At Aquarius Home Services, they know that managing a household and all of the expenses that come with it is no easy task. They also know how important having worry-free water in your home is. Your family deserves water you can trust. You use it every day for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and bathing. That's why they are excited to share their summer trade-in and trade-up program. Trade in your old water softener and trade up to a Connecticut whole home water treatment system. The best part? You can get in it with a voice crack. You can get an additional $500 off on top of their summer sale prices. Say goodbye to hard water, rust stains, and unwanted contaminants, and hello to cleaner, worry-free water flowing through every faucet all day, every day. I also want to talk about great clips. So if you've got kids, you know back to school season is a lot. Supply list, shoe shopping, juggling all the schedules. It's not exactly a magical time of year. The Great Clips app, though, that really does work like magic. With just a few taps, you can find a salon nearby, see the wait time, and check in when it works for you. You can even get a message when it's your turn so you know when to pack up the kids and head over. Oh, and the savings. That's where the real magic happens. So when it's time for back to school haircuts, download the Great Clips app. It may not take care of all of your back to school to-dos, but it'll definitely make some of that stress disappear. Great Clips. It's going to be great. Let's see here. Trevor Ripley. I'll rip off a bunch quickly here. Is Trevor Ripley, is Ty Felton actually pushing Jennings for playing time? I would say, there are probably going to be certain packages where if the Vikings want somebody to take the top off vertically, maybe Ty Felton has more, I don't know, runway to do that. But I just expect Jawan Jennings to play a pretty big role. He's paid to do so. Let's see here. Carson Babini, do you think there could be a competition for the backup quarterback spot between JJ and Carson Wentz, especially after what we saw Saturday? I would say this. Kevin O'Connell, I asked him directly about it when he named Kyler Murray the starter. I said, is J.J. McCarthy the backup? He said yes, pretty convincingly. And so I expect that internally they're going to use these next couple weeks to evaluate in full, all really the entire roster, but that includes the quarterback position of what gives them the best chance. And so I really think for JJ McCarthy to prove that he can be relied upon in that spot, if turned to, that's going to be the most important thing. And so Saturday was a data point to that. I think every practice this week, joint practices especially, is going to be a data point to that moving forward. Just the day-to-day, activity and habits and just how it looks every day internally. I think that's going to play a role. So that's where I'm at with that. Let's see. I really just got a good one. J.E. asks, if the moon were made of ribs, what would would you eat the moon? It's a simple question. Absolutely. I'd eat the whole moon. I love ribs, one of my favorite foods. The question I would have for you guys is, where is the best rib in the Twin Cities? Like Animales probably has some good ribs. I think I've had those before, but I'm here for some ideas if you guys have them. Cade Delisle asked, how's Jake Golday been looking? I thought Jake Golday looked pretty solid on film, lined up in a bunch of spots, looked like he got off blocks pretty well. There's definitely going to be a speed of the game acclimation for him, but for where you would hope a guy like him playing multiple spots where he would be at this point, it's pretty solid. So that's what I'd say about Jake Golday. And let's do one more. Rock NHL, is it overstated how good the NFC North is? Feels like every other team in the division has just as many questions, if not more than the Vikings. Bears seem like a prime candidate for regression. I would say, I can understand the perspective with that, but I would argue that, even all four of the quarterbacks, there's variance with Caleb Williams and Kyler Murray and even Jordan Love at times because of their play style. But like all of these guys have established over the course of not lengthy in Caleb Williams' case, or even in Jordan Love's case, but like over the span of multiple years, that they can all be average to above average level quarterbacks. And so you start there. And then when you think about the talent on the Lions offense, when you think about the coaching of Ben Johnson, when you think about the consistency of what the Packers have been on offense, I would just say that the data points would probably indicate that all of these, and even you think about where the Vikings have been offensively and really defensively more than anything over the last few years, like I think there's just reason to believe in the floor of a lot of these teams. Now, the upside, Rock NHL, I do think that is a question. Like if the Lions durability concerns maintain or remain, that's an interesting one. If the Bears defense turnover regression happens, like that's something to note. If the Packers offensive line isn't as good and defensively they have transitioned with coordinators, like I do think that could limit the ceiling. But I would say from a floor perspective, it's probably more solid, even though you never really know, than maybe some other divisions. But I'd be curious what you guys think on that. But that'll probably do it for the early week episode of the Alec Lewis Show, episode 192. Like I said, comprehensive coverage on joint practices at theathletic.com. We'll be back later this week with a guest who you are very familiar with, and looking forward to all of it. Any other questions you got, toss them in the comments, throw them at me on social media at Alec_Lewis, at Alec Lewis Show. But with that, hope you guys have a great evening, great morning if you're listening on Wednesday, and we will talk to you very, very soon.